almost everyone used to assume that if you did any kind of work around prisons, you were working for prison reform. If one looks at the history of the prisons in this country, one sees that from the very beginning, it was about reform. The prison itself was supposed to be a reform, right? And then reforms have actually helped over time to create a stronger institution of imprisonment. Some years ago, I would say that for me personally, I began to consider myself a prison abolitionist in the early 70s.
I'm going to keep on struggling to free the Soledad brothers and all political prisoners, because I think that what has happened to me is only a very tiny, minute example of what is happening to them.
There was a strong movement for prison abolition that was expressed, for example, in the Attica rebellion.
We are men. We are not beasts, and we do not intend to be beaten or driven as such. The entire prison populace, that means each and every one of us here, has set forth to change forever the ruthless brutalization and disregard for the lives of the prisoners here and throughout the United States.
If one looks at the media of that era, newspaper articles, you'll see that actually very prominent figures are taking seriously the idea that we need an alternative to imprisonment because it wasn't working. The problem is this idea that prisons don't work has been with us almost as long as prisons have been with us. And so there have been those who say that prisons don't work, and then they say, well, what do we need? Let's reform the prison so it works. So let's create a better prison, a bigger and better prison. And then that prison doesn't work. So what do? We reform it by making the institution stronger. And so what happens is that you're caught in this circle that where the solution to the problem always becomes the problem itself, and it reproduces the problem. So the prison is a problem. The solution to the problem becomes the prison, and so forth and so on. So this is why it's necessary to break that cycle and to talk about alternatives that are completely outside of the universe of the prison.
So we have to think differently. There are lots of ways to do that. One is to look outside of the United States and see how the vast majority of the world's population deal with all kinds of problems and solutions to them. The way that poor countries and countries with diverse populations manage to figure out how to understand and cope with differences, including behavioral differences between people without locking people in cages and so forth. Well, obviously, to get to abolition, we have to reshape how we do things, right, in terms of practices, policies, everything. So, strictly speaking, that would be reform. But the question is, can we figure out a way to engage in non-reformist reform, which is to say reform that doesn't make the prison system bigger, just as we seek to engage in reform that doesn't make the education system expel or miseducate ever more children, right? Just as we try to think about how we can reform things so that they become new rather than more of the same.
They don't care even about a million man, million woman, million youth march. You can get 10 million people out there one day. One day. They don't care about that. They can deal with that. But it's the ongoing work that's a threat to this system. It's people every day working for their freedom, making it clear that our freedom is important to us and that we ain't going to sit back and watch these prisons build faster than we can blink an eye and be filled just as fast. We ain't going to have it. That's the message we got to send.
Initially, critical resistance was a movement coming out of a conference that was created by a group of about 25 scholar activists, former prisoners, people who were still in prison, artists, lawyers. We simply got together in the Bay Area and decided that we wanted to bring together people who were doing work around prison issues. We wanted to refocus people's attention on something we then began to call, using Mike Davis's term, the prison industrial complex. That was because we noticed then, this was in 1997, that people tended to assume that whoever was in prison because they had committed a crime. And it may be true that people who are in prison have committed crimes, but that may not be the reason why they're there, because many other people commit crimes and don't go to prison. So we wanted to popularize an analysis that would allow people to use terms, new vocabularies, terms like the prison industrial complex. And I must say that we thought that that our conference would be successful if we attracted 300 or 400 people. That was our initial goal. But as it turned out, something like 3,500 people showed up. It was quite incredible because this was a conference that was organized in the old way. You know, we had hardly any funding. We had no paid staff at all. Everyone volunteered.
This gathering has been a long time coming. And of course, many of you who are here this weekend have been working with the most incredible determination over years and over decades. I don't know, but this may very well be the first time that so many of us have gathered together to figure out how to organize a national, sustained anti-prison campaign. Anti-prison campaign.
It's been a long time. It's been coming. It's been a long time.
And Critical Resistance is a national movement to abolish what we call the prison industrial complex. So in other words, to end the use of policing and prisons and surveillance to solve what are essentially social, economic, and political problems. So we're working to sort of simultaneously dismantle the use of incarceration in U.S. society and build the kind of society that would not need to rely on prisons and policing.
And so what Critical Resistance has become is an explicitly abolitionist organization. And the way in which it understands abolition has so much more to do with the rest of the society in the world than just the prison industrial complex itself. What Critical Resistance understands at the core of its analysis is that the prison industrial complex is, in a sense, a crystallization of the forms of white supremacist and class and gender violence that we see in the world at large, and particularly in the United States at large. The problem with prison as a reform is what you're really asking for is a reform of violence.
We have the lights on 24/7, and the electric fence behind me is going all the time.
What you're asking for is a reforming of a racist-slave relation. And the fact is, to reform that is really just to change the institutional arrangement in which the violence happens. It does not directly address the relation of violence itself. On the one hand, if we're talking about an institution that at its core is about a systemic way to practice racist violence on large numbers of people, and class violence on large numbers of people, and gender and national violence on large numbers of people. If that is at the core of the prison system, and we understand that, and we dispute the premise that this is really about criminality and criminal law, then what we can understand politically is that the reform impulse is actually wrong-headed from the start.
How many beds can we build, and how fast can we build them? We've now progressed in our thinking to say not only how many beds can we build, but can we build the right kind of beds for the needs of our population.
What's so significant about this is there's about $6 billion worth of additional AB 900 funded projects that will be started and under construction within the next 5 years.
The team members that Chris talked about earlier, Nocton Lewis, the construction team, they're going to partner together with our Green Building Services consultant to identify opportunities to be more energy efficient, more environmentally friendly.
To reform is to suggest that there is a good way to have this system exist. right? But there's a humane way to have a profoundly racist, classist, misogynist, and sexist institution exist. What abolitionist politics attempts to address is the relations of violence themselves. In the very short term, we have to deal with the fact that people are dying because they're not getting adequate health care. That's fine. But our objective is not to make the prison a more functional healthcare institution. Our objective is actually to eliminate the relation of violence that is at the core of this entire carceral prison system to begin with.
If we shift the register a bit and talk about what it means to be an abolitionist, how one has to rethink not only modes of justice that happen at institutional levels, but how we personally think about our relations with one another. In this country and in the West in general, we have come to think about revenge as the only possible response when one is the target of wrongdoing, or when something bad is done to us. Our first response is to think about how to get back at the person who did it. So how do we change that that idea?
2003, I was sober about 4 years. 4 years and some months, and I was doing good. You know, I was going to program and staying sober, and I'd given birth to my my one son, Richard, and you know, just in the midst of my serenity and my what I would call, you know, halfway normal life, something I didn't know before, I'd gotten a phone call at like 3 in the morning, and I was asleep, and my stepdaughter answered the phone. And basically it was some detectives calling from Riverside, wanting to inform me of a tragedy that took place in my family. And so yeah, that phone call told me that my mom and my 13-year-old son had been tragically murdered. The guy that committed the murders was going out with my daughter. It was like a powerless moment, you know, completely powerless, completely just without, you know, ability to do anything about it, you know. I you know, got involved in the lead workshop, got involved in critical resistance, and, you know, they just really helped me a lot, you know, to see that, you know, this guy can be rehabilitated, you know, that, you know, as much as I don't want to think that, you know, I know today that it's a possibility, you know, that, you know, his life is being wasted just sitting in prison, you know, completely. That's not the answer, you know, and I know it's not the answer, you know, him sitting in jail. You know, his story can be used to help other people, you know. You hear all the time on the news about boyfriends killing their girlfriends, and, you know, husbands killing their girlfriends, girls killing their, you know, so obviously there's a problem, you know. So I don't think sitting him in jail is the answer. You know, he had a moment in his life where he snapped. He snapped. You know, I mean, there's moments in my life, you know, with my kids back where I snap. You know, I don't do anything stupid like that, but, you know, who's to say that's not possible for any one of us, you know? And we all have the ability to, you know, find help. You know, we all have that right to find help, you know?
So you might say that, you know, what people in critical resistance call abolitionist values requires us to rethink our own emotional responses. So alternatives would involve different modes of justice, reparative justice, restorative justice, justice that does not rely on retribution and revenge. There are existing organizations. There's in Oakland, for example, Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth. My sister happens to be the executive director of that organization. They go into schools. They go into middle schools and high schools, and they work with kids. And they teach them how to resolve conflict by talking to each other and by healing whatever issues and conflicts emerge by sitting around in a circle and talking about them. And almost every school they've worked in, within a short period of time, there are no more fights. People learn different ways of dealing with what is perceived as wrongdoing. Why can't that happen on a larger level? Why does the court system have to assume that somebody is always right, somebody is always wrong, and somebody has to pay for it? The whole notions, the concepts that we use, a debt to society, are really all about retribution.
The question of what we can learn from liberation movements and other places is a good one, because it's not by accident that the United States is the wealthiest country in the world, or the place that has the most people locked up per capita, a quarter of the world's incarcerated population, or the place that disproportionately spends resources on policing people and putting them in cages. We know the roots of this country are in a brutal form of racial capitalism, but where that brings us today is we get to live in this material comfort that most people around the world don't get. And that we're on lockdown, not just physically, but in our minds, in a way to keep that system functioning, to keep the status quo, not just in this country, but in the world, for global domination and neoliberalism. So in the US, we live in the belly of the beast, or the brain of the monster, as the Zapatistas call it. And we're living with what I think of as a cop in our head. So that kind of keeps our imagination on lockdown, our visions of what's possible on lockdown. And it's something that from that place, we can learn from others around the world. Ultimately, we are kind of flexing that muscle of dreaming and imagining a different way of doing things, and not just staying in our imagination, but putting it into practice, even in small ways in our community, to see how it works. What would it look like to do things differently? And from there, kind of rethink, tweak, and keep going, reiterating. We're experimenting. We're not sure things are going to work, but at least we're trying these alternative ways of dealing with each other when we have conflict or when we have interpersonal violence. In terms of what I've been able to learn from the Zapatistas in particular is that when they developed their autonomous territories, they had to think about, well, how will we deal with interpersonal conflicts? We don't have police, we don't have military, we're creating a boundary where we don't let them in, but we still have our own conflicts. And within that, gender violence emerged as one of the main issues happening in local communities within the territories. And they developed revolutionary women's laws to think about how they would deal with it and how they would practice a different way of dealing with conflict amongst them. And they were able to make big headway in the ways that they changed roles in society in the new autonomous territories, of elevating women's roles in the day-to-day decision-making of, economic cooperatives or education cooperatives or agricultural cooperatives. There's different roles for different people. That's one way, but the other is to explicitly talk about how violence of the state has created and exacerbated kind of domestic violence, and how they started to kind of take that apart.
Because so much of what we have to do right now is a politics of survival, in essence, right? And a politics of urgent reform, which is different than reformism. We have to sometimes engage in urgent reform because we want to make it to the next step of sometimes literally of life, right? Sometimes we have to engage in a politics of survival and urgent reform because some people will simply be gone, both in the sense of being locked up for a long time or dead, if we're not taking those practices seriously. So this makes the on-the-ground rendition of abolitionist politics very difficult and very complex and challenging. Part of the abolitionist politics is that it's to defeat the sense of isolation and individualism that is oftentimes inculcated by the criminal justice system, which treats people as individuals, right? Or under this mythology that they're being treated as individuals. What abolition on the ground in part looks like is to break down those walls of isolation and individual compartmentalization, and to say this is happening to a bunch of us, right? My story is not that different than yours. What happened to me was very similar to what was happening to the guy in the next neighborhood or the guy in the cell right next to me in the jail. So what I've seen in organizations that take that kind of politics seriously is a much more collective systemic analysis that links people's individual histories to a systemic violence. And what that leads to then is a bunch of different political conclusions. Then what people are saying is no longer, well, how can we just get people good lawyers, right? They're not stopping at that. What they're saying is that, yeah, well, we need good lawyers to try to keep us from going to jail and prison. But what we also have here is an institution, a system, which is actually targeting us, right? And what we need to do is challenge that system and that logic. If we don't do that, then we can have all the good lawyers in the world. We're just going to be fighting a defensive battle for the rest of our lives and for the rest of eternity. So on the ground, what abolitionist politics looks like the most is systemic challenge, right? Politics that is willing to engage in the urgency of survival and reform, but which is absolutely unwilling to stop there, which insists on saying this is not a problem that can be solved with reform. Reform ultimately is only going to perpetuate it. What we need to do is attack the fundamental institutional logic of what it is we are in. And that can happen in so many different kinds of ways. I think we need to be more creative in how we do it.
I went to New Orleans and there were all these people working around prison abolition. And they have this broad view of what could happen instead of incarcerating people, chaining people, putting them in cages. And it was holistic. It was good for the community, and it was good for the person, and it would just make a better world. And I didn't know people were there doing that. No people thought like that. And it broadened my view of what could happen instead of incarceration. And it got me to thinking more broadly about alternatives to prison. Prison abolition. And it made me feel really good to be there.
And we met at an anti-prison organizing meeting and started talking. And I found out that she ran sober living homes for women who were coming home from prison.
Melissa Burch came in and asked me could she come and do a workshop. And I said yes. And we began, she actually designed it and began to bring in information to the women. Same information that I had got, same information that allowed me to heal a little deeper, both my pain and my shame of incarceration.
Susan told me, very early in our relationship that becoming politically conscious and understanding, the larger set of conditions that had led to her own addiction and imprisonment was really transformative for her in her own recovery and just becoming a new person after her release from incarceration. Began a partnership which later became the LEAD project, which stands for Leadership, Education, Action, and Dialogue. And so the project just started, as a very grassroots effort where myself and other members of Critical Resistance went to A New Way of Life, to one of the houses there for women, and did workshops on different aspects of the prison industrial complex a couple of times a month.
The purpose of the LEAD project is to create an environment and platform to give the residents of A New Way of Life information about incarceration, about the increase in the rates of incarceration, to give them the history of incarceration, information about alternatives to incarceration. Not only information about it, but it allows them to create their own vision and view of what could happen instead of incarceration. It also gives them an understanding of the economics of incarceration. After women have participated, they go out with more of an awareness of what is going on and how systems are not functioning right. They are able to advocate on behalf of themselves and their community. Don't take it personal and take it in that they're not worthy. They understand that this person is not doing their job, or this system is broken,
and it allows them to be able to stand in the face of difficulties instead of being a victim of the system once again.
So the LEAD project grew to encompass 3 key components: the bi-monthly workshops, a political library at one of the houses of A New Way of Life, and an internship program through which we started inviting a couple of women from A New Way of Life to do media projects that would explore these issues in further depth.
A New Way of Life, contrast to prison or jail, just in a way it's way more productive. It's the complete opposite. A New Way of Life as a reentry project is great, but A New Way of Life as a preventative measure or as an alternative to prison would really be ideal. In contrast, jail completely robs you of that ideal. You're made to think that that's not only not possible, but that it shouldn't be that way.
My name is Patricia, and we're going to walk over here to my apartment. I live right here in this apartment building that we're coming up to. Before I got to this apartment, I was living in a facility called A New Way of Life, and I got there by means of jail, and I ended up staying there for about 2 years, and the facility was real good to me. They encouraged me to go to school. They encouraged me to do a lot of stuff, and it was through them that I got involved in the All of Us or None and the LEAD project workshops and my internship with them. But they helped me, they helped me get my Section 8, my housing that I'm living in right now with my boys. Through A New Way of Life and through my Section 8, I was able to regain custody of my kids. Sue Burton had asked me to open up a sober living for her in Compton. And I said, sure, why not? That was awesome that she even thought that I had those abilities. She said, Patricia, there's a lot about you that has been buried, that I see your potential, that you just don't even have a chance. Haven't given yourself a chance to have any of it grow. And, she makes me cry a lot, Sue does, because there's just little things, Sue being with her background too, and just the whole facility with everybody's background, it's kind of like a family thing.
I'm grateful to Susan Burton because of her understanding of alternatives to the prison industrial complex. Her vision as being an alternative. So being part of that movement is powerful to me.
There was another conference in Oakland, in the San Francisco Bay Area, called CR10, 10th Anniversary Conference. And what was so remarkable about that conference was that, as I looked around, most of the participants were too young to have been at the first conference. So it was really very exciting to see, young people taking these ideas and developing them in so many directions.
I went to the Critical Resistance Conference in Oakland just this past year, and I was so amazed. There were so many people, and to see that so many other people have the same views as I do was strong to me.
I say to myself, going to the convention and seeing all those movies that I saw about prison and about abolishment, I say to myself, there is a way. There is a way to live without prison. We can, as a whole, implement concepts to make that happen. I believe that there should be more services that, what's that called, intervention, prior to actual damage. When you see something starting, facilities, more facilities for teenagers, for mothers and children, for single fathers and their children,
The prison industrial complex is so, it's everywhere. And so it's so hard to see that there can be anything to change it. So you need organizations like Critical Resistance and the conference to remind us on a daily basis, because it's so easy to slip back into the comfortable, idea that nothing can be done.
Because of the moment that we're in, a lot of people are asking us about Sister to Sister. So it was in 1996 in Brooklyn, New York. We were young Black and Latina women in our early to mid 20s. We were working with 12 to 17-year-old young women, and we were building collective power, doing community organizing, doing holistic political education. And we started to work on police violence because that was the issue that was affecting us. And from there, we started to build with other organizations citywide, working on police brutality, the coalition, the citywide coalition against police brutality. We brought a gender and sexuality cut to the coalition, and we were building power around police brutality, pre 9/11, right? But we were so good at doing that work and articulating it and understanding what the problem was and kind of building consciousness about that problem. But what we weren't doing is giving ourselves the space and the time to figure out what would we replace that with.
And that's when we came up with Sisters Liberated Ground, which was a territory where we imagined that we could create a space where violence against women wouldn't be tolerated, where we could create healthy relationships, where we could challenge state violence, where we could model the kind of world that we actually wanted to see. Because we didn't even feel like, even when people called the police, even when people called the cops, that they weren't helpful, they weren't a solution for us. And so we were really trying to envision and act something different. And I feel like because we were young too, we were willing to experiment. But it had a lot of components. We had a hotline. We did healing circles. We had public art that kind of gave a lot of the messages that we talked about. We had a pledge where people would say, I commit to fighting against these kinds of violences. We did workshops. We did invisible theater, street theater. We had videos that we did, that young women did, and we would show them in barbershops
and outside on, in public spaces. And we had sister circles, which were kind of like the organizing cells for the project of a group of young women who would support each other when anything happened, right? And take collective action to confront the violence together.
Yes, absolutely.
When we did the exercise of a world without prisons, and I got the opportunity to actually build the neighborhood that I envisioned as a neighborhood where I wanted to live, it brought the concept home and real alive for me that if we had those basic needs, the institutions within our community, there would be no huge police force literally hunting us down, and especially hunting young folks in our community, hunting them down and incarcerating them. And we'd have universities, we'd have co-ops, we'd have parks, we'd have arts, we'd have a lot of different things, a lot of things that we need and don't have today.
Our project was to imagine a community without sort of what we thought security would look like without policing and prisons. So just trying to think about what security means apart from just aggression and heavy policing and abandoning people, sending them to jail.
To imagine a community that would be our ideal community. So to think about the communities that we live in now, and to think about the things that we would change and what we would create if we could create our own ideal place to live and work and love, and what that would look like and what that would include.
Yep.
Can
Animals just kind of run free.
Yeah.
Life.
Fresh eggs every morning.
Yes.
See information like what does that look like? What would it look like? We don't like that in our community. They go in the garden.
The garden.
By doing this work around prison issues, we would be compelled to come up with new ideas of how to address violence, intimate violence, violence, against children. I can say now that I am totally convinced that this broken prison system, which has to be broken, it's a system that cannot be fixed, is in large part responsible for the pandemic of child abuse, child sexual abuse in this country. Because when we assume that a person who has committed such a horrible act against a child only needs to be thrown away into a prison, that means we abdicate our responsibility of thinking about what has produced this individual who has committed this horrendous act. If we think about that, usually we discover that this person was at one time in his or her life a victim of child abuse, him or herself. If we simply assume that using the prison system to deal with it is going to be the solution, we're actually perpetrating the problem. And we're allowing that generational dynamic to continue over and over and over again.
So I think in the vision and practice of abolition that I've been able to be a part of with other people, now in Austin, Texas, with an organization called CCU, we're working on this as well, is not just thinking about, in this moment right now, the global pandemic, defunding the police, which we've been doing for years, working on that. But it's not just about what we don't want. It's not just about taking resources and power from the local police system, but what would we need to put into place in addition to taking away power from policing in order to advance safety for our community. And I think that's the piece of abolition that we're not talking about enough. It's not just that we want less policing, less surveillance, less incarceration, but what do we want more of? And how would we do that? For us, it's really talking about economic systems, direct cash transfers to low-income folks. It's about talking about low-income housing and what people would need to have truly affordable places to live. It's about public health and wellness. These investments in our local community for us to have a better way of life, a better way of surviving, is what would advance public safety in conjunction with taking away power from policing. And how can we take 40% of most of our city budgets that are going to policing and move all that money into these other investments in community? That's the practice of abolition that I think we need to work on and develop more, both sides of that.
So abolition. Abolition proposes that we all think about and act on our thinking about the fact that the liberation movements of the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, and 21st century have not been completed. The grand liberation movements of modernity have never been accomplished. We've done pieces here and pieces there, but we're still fighting for large-scale freedom. Freedom from racism, freedom from sexism, freedom from heteronormativity, and freedom from capitalism, and for the need to imagine that my gain must be your loss. So abolition is a way for me to think about all of the freedom struggles that people have been engaged in all over the world around so many different issues, and pulling the threads of those struggles all together in a moment where we can really see and feel how prison is a central piece of the puzzle of how it is we all get free. right? So prison abolition is not, in my view, simply a kind of silly notion of, oh, well, we'll just like unlock all the prisons, tell everybody, oops, we didn't mean it, sorry, see you later, and then get on with our lives unchanged in all other respects. That's crazy. It's crazy. What's not crazy, however, but which is called crazy by some, is the idea that we stop and think how it is there are 2.5 million people in prison in the United States, that the United States has fully 1/4 of all the prisoners on the planet locked up here in cages in the United States, and say, well, what makes the United States different in its broad-based use of prisons, and how does that connect to all of the other unfinished liberation movements that I just kind of listed briefly? Liberation from want, liberation from homelessness, liberation to be educated, liberation to be in one's body as one wishes to be in one's body, including changing, if that's what one wants to do. All of these aspects of life that over time have been marginalized and criminalized come back to the center when we think really hard about prison. Angela Davis has written a book called Abolition Democracy, and I think in her book she lays out some of the larger and forward-looking political principles of what it is I'm trying to describe. But on the ground, for me, what abolition looks like is the kind of radical dependency that I described when I talked about how communities that have lots of people sent to prison are more disorderly and desperate than communities that are otherwise the same, that don't have lots of people sent to prison.
The answer, what do we have instead of prisons, you know, people often want a very simple answer. Well, instead of prisons, we have a new way of life. And that's part of the answer, definitely, but really, envisioning a world without prisons, to me, means envisioning a whole different world. So we would have to start with a society that actually had meeting people's basic needs as its first priority, rather than profits and the greed-driven system that we have. And so, people having access to food, clothing, shelter, quality education, living wage jobs, adequate housing. If we were to actually provide for those things as a society, most of what is called crime would disappear.
So I think that why we co-wrote the CR, Critical Resistance Insight Statement, many reasons to make the links between state violence and interpersonal violence, and how the way that the violence against women movement that later became kind of a service industry promoted the criminalization of domestic violence as a win, right, as an accomplishment, and that served to further criminalize communities, in particular low-income communities of color. Another reason for cops to come and interfere in people's homes and lives. So we wanted to recognize how those two things are interrelated, and how the work against violence against women was actually serving to criminalize our communities more. Yet at the other side, to understand that ultimately, as we envision a world without policing and prisons, we would have to deal with interpersonal violence and domestic violence in particular, and think about how we might do that. For me, some of the learning has come from the MST, the Landless Rural Workers Movement in Brazil, where it's over 900,000 families strong of landless people who have been organizing for many years to take over idle land of very wealthy landowners that had land that wasn't being used, and to develop encampments, which is when they take over land, live in these makeshift tents maybe for a year or two until they win title to the land, and then they go from encampments to settlements, and they create settlements where they live. Clearly, the cops won't come to these places. These are kind of autonomous territories like the Zapatistas, where they've had to develop their own way of dealing with interpersonal conflict without policing. And so some of the main lessons I think that I learned in collaboration with them and visiting with them over the years, one is that below all of it, the building block below thinking about how we deal with violence is building community intentionally, that comes first. Then we think about how we deal with conflict. First, how do we build a sense of real community connection and accountability, which is something that is intentionally built in the MST organizing process, just like it needs to be and is intentionally built in any of our local organizing projects. That comes first. From there, you can scaffold on top of that how we'll deal with conflict. But if we don't have a sense of relationships, of love and care with each other, and a sense of community, we can't deal with our conflicts with each other. There were people whose job it was to interfere when there was violence, interpersonal violence, but those were women. And they were usually older women walking around with machetes and called in to talk to those who are having in the moment of crisis or after a conflict happens, to bring people in. And for me, what I learned there is not only that women's roles are central in all aspects of life, but that if for my imagination of everything I've seen in my life of policing and cops, which would be kind of like at best a punitive father or a bully, is the way that cops are, to this other way of thinking about the person that would interfere when we have conflict as a kind of fiercely loving grandmother, So she's still fierce, but she's loving and she's caring and she wants to be in it with you in the moment of the crisis and kind of help you through it. And for me, that's a different vision of how we might deal with conflicts without policing. And so if we have the cop in the head, that's kind of racial capitalism, then the cop in the heart, I would say, that we have is heteropatriarchy. And it's kind of the way that we relate with each other on a more intimate level of wives and children being property of men, historically, and domination and violence happening in the nuclear family, and that being cemented in us so that we can't even imagine a different way of dealing with conflict that would be a loving, embracing grandmother instead of a bully father.
I don't think ever, even in the perfect society, we would never be completely free from violence or harm or, people hurting one another sometimes. And so what would we do instead of that? We would need to build another system of community accountability where people could be held accountable for their actions, but within a much broader context. So, if I hurt someone in my community, we look at how we can hold me accountable for that and how I can, make that up to that person. But we also look at what are the circumstances in my life that led me to act in that way, and is there some way that I need healing or something that's not whole in my life. So really looking at a system that not only punishes individuals, but rather holds whole communities accountable for behavior and tries to actually get at the root of the problems. The main thing that doesn't work about the prison industrial complex is that it doesn't actually ever ask, why did this act of violence happen, or why did this person steal this thing? It never gets at the actual roots of the problem. So I think abolition envisions just a very different system where instead of just punishing acts, we would actually try to solve underlying problems that lead to harm. A new way of life is part of an abolitionist vision, part of what we envision in terms of, what would we do without prisons. It's a safe place where women heal, recover, examine what happened in their lives, and try to move forward. And that it is the kind of community-based institution that is a key part of an abolitionist vision. So the partnership, a partnership between critical resistance and a new way of life is critical, I think, to building this vision of abolition.
Now I think we can say that there's not only a critical resistance organization, and that organization is very important. It's headquartered in Oakland. There are chapters all over the country, strong chapters in New York, a very strong chapter in New Orleans and in other places. But there's also a broader movement. Many people now are aware of this thing we call prison industrial complex. And also, and this was the hallmark of the most recent conference, the notion of prison abolition doesn't seem so way out and crazy any longer. People are very seriously considering prison abolition.
I'm here because I don't know how to live, and somebody made a call. I didn't know they was gonna call Susan, but they called, and thank God. You know, so I'm grateful for it too. You know, and I don't say thank you because it's not. I can't say thank you. I can just show you in my behavior and show you that when, like she said, when it's time for me to go. And one day maybe I can be running a house or doing something if I give myself open mind and just be still. Just be still long enough to do something in my life.
So if they had more programs like this or more people in the world like Ms. Burton, maybe there would be some help in the people that really wanted it. Because see, I didn't know I wanted it until I walked through her door.
I hope that being here in a new way of life, that people are able to reconnect with themselves, with their true selves, their sense of self, the ownership of who they are, and not what they have to become because of the environment being so injurious.
This is the first home that I opened up for women coming home from prisons in 1998. It was my home. It had 3 bedrooms, and I just went for it. I wanted to make a difference, you know, in my community, in the lives of women who so desperately needed a chance. So this is where the women and their children live, and when we first opened up, this was my whole little space that I lived in and worked in. I had a day bed and a computer and a file cabinet in there, and so this is one of the bedrooms. Good space.
The kids' room.
Yes, the kids' room. These are just some of the kids who belong to the women. This is another bedroom. And I just want to say it's not Bayford, but it's home and a place where people can heal, reunite with their children, start family, find their place in the community, and go on to live a constructive and productive life, and hopefully become an advocate and a voice for prison abolition.